Sandra?
Okay.
All right, you can go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon to the Schemmel Forum on Zoom. Well, I'm not exactly on Zoom. We are here to celebrate Black History Month today with the most distinguished scholar and activist, Dr. Martha Jones. In fact, we would be honored to welcome Dr. Jones in any month of the year. She's come to discuss with us her latest book, Vanguard, How Black Women Overcame Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Would that it were not such a struggle, would that there were no barriers for Black women to overcome. We've seen in these difficult days amazing leadership, outstanding civic responsibility, and dauntless energy in African American women, relentlessly aiming to make sure that our country would continue to aspire to and work towards liberty and justice for all. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. Her book tells the epic story of African American women's pursuit of political power and how it transformed America, shaping the story of American democracy. We're honored to have you with us today, Dr. Jones, to learn from you your wisdom and celebrate Black History Month.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to you, Sandra, but to everybody there who is really going the extra mile to bring us together for a conversation this afternoon, despite terrible weather in some parts of the country and the conditions of pandemic. I'm very, very honored and very happy, in fact, to see you all and your faces here on the Zoom. So I do want to spend some time talking with you about the women of Vanguard. And as Sandra has suggested, their stories have come to feel, I think it's fair to say, all the more relevant, all the more essential as we find ourselves in a moment, I think, still processing, still recovering from, still making sense of the long 2020 election cycle. So I want to start there in the present and then take you back to the years surrounding the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. I know most of you are aware that last year in 2020, we marked 100 years since the 19th Amendment was ratified. So I want to take you through some of that history as a way of, in fact, framing and contextualizing the moment in which we find ourselves. So perhaps you were like me in August of 2020. I was confined in pandemic conditions, but that didn't stop me from attending the Democratic National Convention because, of course, that event was televised, abbreviated, but also televised. And like millions of Americans, I tuned in for what, by all accounts, was a historic moment when then Senator Kamala Harris of California accepted her nomination by Joe Biden to run for the vice presidency. And then Senator Harris gave a speech, and it was the sort of speech that I, as a student, as someone who attends very deliberately to African-American women's politics in the 21st century, it was the sort of speech, on the one hand, I expected, which is that it is still the case, I think, when African-American women step to major platforms, step to the national podium, they're called upon to explain how they come to be there, that their presence is still remarkable. They are oftentimes firsts, and certainly in the example of Senator Harris, historic. And she, like many women before her of this generation, did indeed take time before she launched into the stump speech portion of the evening, which of course is also obligatory. She told us something about herself. And how she had come to be there. And the phrase she used, the metaphor she used, was standing on the shoulders, right? She explained that she was standing there, if you will, solo at the podium, but in fact, she was someone who stood on the shoulders of many women who came before her. Now, the first woman that she acknowledged in this context was her own mother. And likely you've heard something about now Vice President Harris's mother, who was herself a young student, an immigrant from India to the United States, who studied in California and went on to have a long and remarkable career as a cancer researcher. A woman who, as Senator Harris explains, raised her daughters, Kamala and Maya, to be two women who did not countenance the kinds of limits that people might impose from the outside on their aspirations. But then she went on, Senator Harris did in August of 2020, to invoke 6 additional women from the annals of African-American women's political history, women on whose shoulders, she explained, she stood. They were Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Mary Mcleod Bethune, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Constance Baker Motley. Now, if not every one of those names is yet familiar to you, that is my point. And I think it was Senator Harris's point as well, that we have entered a phase, a chapter, a period in American politics, 21st century politics, in which a familiarity, an acquaintanceship, a knowledge and understanding of African-American women's political history is essential if we are to be informed, astute, discerning, insightful students of our own historical moment. Note that Senator Harris did not invoke Frederick Douglass, nor did she invoke Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan Anthony. She certainly did not invoke Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln. And in that, she leveled a challenge at us to expand, to remediate, to improve upon our understanding of American political history, because her trajectory to now what is the vice presidency is one explained through the lives of these 6 women rather than others that we might, and that other candidates might invoke when explaining how they came to occupy that historic moment. And I think I see Sandra joining us. Terrific. So my talk today is about those 6 women and many others in an effort to aid us on the road to an understanding of this new facet of our political history. And indeed, I want to take us back to 1920, just 100 years ago, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, to help us situate these women in a context. It was in August of 1920 that the US Secretary of State certifies the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And for those of you who might not remember the language, I'll just remind you, it's brief. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Well, now laws that had reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution. And still, the 19th Amendment did not promise or guarantee any women the vote. Laws, now state laws, continued to keep women from the polls based upon their age, their citizenship, residency, mental competence. It was still true in 1920 that American women who married non-citizens were denaturalized, lost their citizenship and their right to vote. So in the fall of 1920, when women show up to register, as they do, they confronted still many hurdles, even if sex wasn't one of them. Now, in our story, of course, there was one additional barrier to women's votes after the federal amendment, and that was racism. It was true that in 1870, 50 years earlier, the 15th Amendment had been set in place, and it expressly forbids states from denying the vote because of race. But by 1920, lawmakers in the American South and West had set in place formidable hurdles that had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s, along with unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching. The deal had been sealed. Local voting officials had effectively constructed a color line, even as they never expressly invoked race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African-American women in too many states became merely equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirits of the 15th and 19th Amendments. And the registration numbers, as best we can gather them from the fall of 1920, reflect the effect of those discriminatory laws. Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found that the books were closed. Now, at the same time, the first waves of Black women voters were already unleashed, even before 1920, as individual states had made women's suffrage the law. In California, starting in 1911, Illinois in 1913, New York in 1917, Black women were already experienced voters by 1920, and they set out to welcome others across the country to join them. How did they do that? Well, one example comes from the city of St. Louis in Missouri, where Black women in 1920, that fall, organized under the auspices of the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA. There, Black women ran a suffrage school. They trained one another in the mechanics of voter registration. They taught one another how to pay poll taxes. They studied to learn how to overcome literacy tests, even when they were administered by begrudging officials. Black women turned out, and the papers report that nearly every woman in the state of, in the city of St. Louis registered in that season, Black and white. But what the vote meant for Black and white women was not the same. African-American women were as deliberate as they were because they knew that in the city of St. Louis, a new housing segregation regime was being set in place, and the mechanism was voter referenda. And so here, Black women are registering, yes, in part as a fulfillment of the promise of the 19th Amendment, but as much because now they can use access to the polls to defeat racism in the city of St. Louis. The second example, briefly, comes from the city of Daytona in Florida. There, the educator and National Association of Colored Women's Clubs leader, Mary Mcleod Bethune, was traveling the state during 1920 to encourage Black women to register. Bethune confronted brutal opposition organized Ku Klux Klan opposition as she traveled the state and won a kind of unwelcome notoriety, so much so that on the eve of Election Day in 1920, local Klans members in Daytona gathered downtown on horseback. After burning a cross in the adjacent river, they marched to the campus of Mrs. Bethune's girls' school, what is today Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona. They marched onto the grounds of her school to intimidate Mrs. Bethune, her faculty, and the Black women of Daytona to keep them from the polls in the fall of 1920. Now, the Klan does not succeed in 1920, and Mrs. Bethune and the Black women of Daytona will turn out and come to the polls together. There is a safety in numbers, they bet, and indeed are able to cast their ballots. But by 1922, when this violence has persistent and has been relentless, Mrs. Bethune will abandon those efforts to use the ballot in the state of Florida. She will go on to have a long career, but it will not include one that rests upon the realization of voting rights. So in the fall of 1920, when Election Day wraps up, African-American women look out across the national landscape and they recognize that too many of them remain disenfranchised. And the question is how to go forward. Part of the responsibility for crafting that strategy falls to Hallie Quinn Brown, who in 1920 is the president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which has become the largest of the Black women's political organizations in the United States, some 300,000 plus members strong. And Hallie Quinn Brown settles upon the view that what African-American women now need in the wake of the 19th Amendment is federal legislation that will give teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendments, will push to the side the state laws, like the literacy tests that are keeping them from the polls. And Brown sets out to craft now what is in essence a new movement for women's voting rights out of the disappointments, out of the ashes of the 19th Amendment. She is a good strategist and recognizes that among the women who have led the campaign for the 19th Amendment are figures like Alice Paul, who, leading the National Women's Party, has rightfully earned a reputation as one of the most radical, creative, and confrontational of the suffrage leaders that bring the nation to ratification of the 19th Amendment. And Hallie Quinn Brown seeks out Alice Paul, thinking that in fact 1920 and what follows might be an opportunity for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the National Women's Party to join forces and to work toward the federal legislation that African-American women need. In the winter of 1921, Brown calls upon Paul and with a delegation to make a formal proposal. And while the precise words that they exchanged haven't survived for us, we do know what Alice Paul did next, which is that she began to fold up the National Women's Party to end that project. And indeed, she moves on by 1923-24 to be the champion of an equal rights amendment, the same equal rights amendment that is still awkwardly making its way toward ratification even today. She leaves Hallie Quinn Brown and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, if you will, behind to now craft their own movement for voting rights. And it is a movement that indeed they will build, a movement that will take them to 1965 and to the passage in that year of the Voting Rights Act. Finally, that federal legislation that Hallie Quinn Brown had been seeking in 1920 is realized in a 45-year-long campaign. What does that campaign look like for African-American women? On the one hand, it's a campaign that very much is in the spirit of the work that women had been doing in St. Louis and in Daytona in 1920. Black women continue in each election cycle to play the ground game of American politics. They register when they can. They cast ballots as they can. They become party operatives. And in a city like Chicago, they begin to have important early successes. For example, by 1928, Black women in Chicago will use the power of their votes to elect Oscar DePriest to Congress. DePriest is the first African-American man to be elected to Congress since 1901, and his success is unequivocally attributable to the organization and the voting efforts of African-American women in that year. So Black women continue to play this ground game, and they can move the needle in state and local contests, even as they are thwarted when it comes to, for example, influencing presidential contests. The second prong of this movement that Black women helped to build unfolds under the auspices of the NAACP, which is waging a legal campaign against 20th century voter suppression, challenging successfully poll taxes, challenging successfully grandfather clauses, challenging successfully whites-only primaries, chipping away at the legal edifice of Jim Crow era voter suppression, opening the way to increasing numbers of Black American voters over the course of this 45-year period. Finally, of course, to get us to 1965 requires a civil rights revolution. And by the 1940s, African-American women, along with African-American men, are the force of thousands, tens of thousands at the grassroots throughout the rest of the American South. African-American women as tacticians, as spokespeople, and as the shock troops of the civil rights movement are going to be absolutely critical to the success of that movement and its essential work in holding the feet of the nation, holding the feet of the Democratic Party to the fire of voting rights, such that the Voting Rights Act becomes law in 1965. Now, I want to end by coming back to the 6 women whom Senator Kamala Harris introduced to the nation in her remarks in August of 2020, because it is indeed a pantheon of women who are critical to, responsible for, and a great deal more architects of the campaign that takes us from 1920 to 1945 and to the realization of African-American women's full voting rights, this history that explains how Senator Harris becomes Vice President Harris. I'll remind you, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Mary Mcleod Bethune, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Constance Baker Motley. Who were they? Mary Church Terrell is the very first president of the National Association of Colored Women and is in some months single-handedly responsible for steering her organization towards suffrage in an era when Black women are unwelcome and their political concerns cannot be heard in national suffrage associations like the National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Terrell builds the NACW as that institution in which Black women can work both for their voting rights and against racism, including the scourge of lynching. And she begins that work in the 1890s. Her peer is Ida B. Wells, the journalist, suffragist, and great champion of anti-lynching politics and legislation in the early 20th century. Wells is at home in her adopted city of Chicago, where she builds, among other institutions, the Alpha Suffrage Club that will be responsible for the turnout that takes Oscar de Priest to Congress in 1928. Mary Mcleod Bethune, whom I've mentioned as an early suffragist, but who will go on by the 1930s to devise a new strategy to win Black women's political power despite disenfranchisement. Bethune will come to Washington in 1935, found the National the National Council of Negro Women, thank you, and will befriend Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and help Franklin Roosevelt found what is colloquially referred to as his Black cabinet in the 1930s. Here, what Bethune learns is that when you're disenfranchised, it doesn't mean that you can't build political relationships, political power, and use patronage as another way to bring Black Americans into influential roles in Washington. And this is the work Mrs. Bethune will do in the 1930s and 1940s, while also struggling to win that Voting Rights Act. Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer, two of the great heroines of the modern civil rights movement. Nash, behind the scenes, the architect of the sitting campaigns of Nashville, Tennessee, architect of important moments in the freedom rides, will ultimately be the genius behind the Selma campaign that brings us those fateful marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama. Diane Nash holds the feet of the nation to the fire of voting rights, using those shock troops of the civil rights era to do so. Her companion in this period is Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi, the one-time sharecropper local voting rights organizer who in 1964 brings the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the Democratic National Convention, a convention that is preparing to nominate Lyndon Johnson as its candidate. Mrs. Hamer has brought her delegation to that convention because, as she argues, the Democrats have seated an all-white Mississippi delegation without the input, without the votes, without the assent, without the consultation of Black Mississippians. Mrs. Hamer will not only take to the floor of that convention, she will take to the national television cameras to decry a party that continues to countenance the kind of white supremacy and the suppression of Black voting rights that is embodied in the seating of the all-white Mississippi delegation, again, holding the feet now of the Democratic Party and Lyndon Johnson to the fire of voting rights, pushing them toward passage of the Voting Rights Act in the next year. And finally, Senator Harris invoked Constance Baker Motley, who as a young attorney is a member of that NAACP team that is litigating voting rights through the 20th century, chipping away at voting rights. Motley will go on to be an office holder in New York City, both at the local and in the state assembly, and will be appointed finally by Lyndon Johnson, a federal judge, and will spend the long balance of her career now as a jurist, overseeing and protecting voting rights from the federal bench. This is the political history that Kamala Harris introduces us to and invokes again and again whenever she has the opportunity to explain her own trajectory. And it is a political history that is new for many Americans, but it is indeed one that I think is essential. And if Kamala Harris's occupancy of the office of the vice president isn't evidence enough for how much we need to understand this history, I'll remind you that in 2020, Kamala Harris ran for vice president alongside 130 African-American women who ran for spots in Congress, who was on the ballot for the 95+% of Black women who voted for her. Part of the story that she tells and that she embodies is a reminder for me that in 2020, to deem her a first is to bestow faint praise. Kamala Harris is the embodiment of indeed how African-American women have become a force in American politics. And I do believe in her telling, she would urge us that to contend with this force, we need to understand better from where it comes. With that, I think I will stop and say thank you again to you all for having me with you. I think we're going to perhaps have time for questions and comments, and thank you all again for the opportunity to join me this afternoon.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Sandra, let's see. Well, let's unmute you, Sandra. Hold on, Sandra, go ahead and unmute. There, okay, I think it's coming.
I muted. I'm
There you
unmuted.
go. There you go.
So Martha.
Yes.
Yeah. It's Sandra. And I just want to say welcome. I'm sorry I've been happy enough to hear your talk, but I was sorry that I was detained in getting on. But I can't even fathom what? I can't even fathom the importance of African American women in this cycle. The energy and creativity, energy that they brought to this campaign was just daunting. You know, it was just wonderful, and it's something that maybe it didn't surprise you, but I just couldn't imagine the vitality and what it brought to the campaign, and how powerful this group is.
Well, it's wonderful to see you. So first of all, secondly, because I teach on Zoom every week. The number one rule of Zoom is no apologies when the technology does not cooperate. I think it's fair to say, but it's wonderful to see your face and to hear you. So thank you so much. You're right to suggest that what we saw unfold in the fall and winter 2020 did not surprise me. I think that the sort of force that we saw Black women bring to bear on the first, the November contest, and then of course we have to remember the January special election in Georgia, really is a continuation of work that Black women have not only done, they had promised to do. And many of us will, of course, be familiar with leader Stacey Abrams, who had made a commitment to her state of Georgia and to us as a nation. And we see the net result of that. I think it's important to frame what African American women did, what they accomplished, what they affected in 2020 as a reflection of a very expert, astute, sophisticated capacity to understand the American electorate, to understand the dynamics of both voter suppression and voter turnout, and a commitment to a strategy that I think we've all seen evidence of its critical nature, which is that old ground game of American politics. Part of what I learned in 2020, of course, is it turns out all those postcards that we write when we live in northern environs and then drop in the mail to voters in places like Georgia do very little. They have little to no effect. And what Abrams, Latasha Brown, and the other organizers in a state like Georgia understand is that voter turnout depends upon relationships. It depends upon embeddedness. It depends upon intimacy and familiarity. And it is a profound lesson for us in what it takes in their example, right, to turn, to flip a state, which in fact is what they effectuated. But that is astute political science. It requires inspiration, it requires political theater, but it is a reflection of astute political science. We can only hope that those who practice political science tune in and catch up and help other folks understand how the ground game of American politics works in the 21st century.
It's not the postcard, it's the personal vigor and connection that works. And 2018 was also a sign of that.
Yeah, very much so.
Questions? Comments? Yeah, Nancy? Nancy?
I think you have to unmute, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you. I know that there were barriers put up for both men and women in voting, but and literacy was one, intimidation was another. What were some of the others?
Sure. We're now talking about early 20th century voter suppression tactics, right? Literacy tests that are administered at the discretion of a local voting official who might ask you to read the 19th Amendment, a rather straightforward and perhaps simple amendment. He might ask you to read the 14th Amendment, and then he will judge your literacy based on his subjective view. And so literacy tests might be applied across the board as a general matter, but how they are administered was very different for Black versus white voters. Here, poll taxes are pay-to-play schemes that require voters many months, oftentimes the year before, to have paid a tax well in advance of Election Day in order to be eligible to cast a ballot on that day. There is no question but that poll taxes disproportionately affect working people, but they especially affect African-American agricultural workers, sharecroppers, for whom cash is not the currency of their lives. Sharecroppers are trading labor for an interest in crops, secure most of their subsistence needs by way of credit that is repaid with the crop. And so the imposition of a pay-to-play requirement disproportionately, vastly disproportionately affects African Americans. Grandfather clauses were the escape hatch for white Americans who might get caught up failing a literacy test or having failed to pay a poll tax. How did voting officials ensure that white people got to vote? By grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses went, in essence, if your grandfather could vote before 1867, then you were excused from these other strictures. Well, in the American South, what that meant was that only white Americans would be benefit from the get out of jail free card that was the grandfather clause, because only white Americans could vote before 1867 in the American South. The majority of Black Americans were descended from enslaved people. So I hope what you're hearing in these, right, is tactics that, much like voter suppression tactics in the 21st century, are neutral on their face, right? They don't specifically bar Black Americans from voting, but they are designed deliberately and openly. When we look at the debates in the state legislatures that promulgate these laws, they are openly confess that the purpose is to maximize the effect of white voters and to minimize, if not wholly extinguish, the voting force of Black Americans. So there is, I think, for us a unsettling resonance between voter suppression tactics in 1920 and those that were in effect in 2020, which also hold themselves out as being racially neutral, but have a disproportionate effect upon voters of color in the 21st century. So thank you for that.
Libby, can you unmute yourself?
Okay.
There you go.
I'm interested in the women's clubs that started. I mean, that was a time that they would depend on mail, I assume. I don't know how they communicated between towns and cities to organize these groups and how the women had time to get them started. But I'm really interested in the history of some of those clubs.
Sure, thank you for that. The origins of what we come to call the African American Women's Club movement lie in the Civil War era. The Civil War brings, by 1863, tens of thousands of African American men into the Union Army, and at the same time, tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people, refugees, who sort of consolidate around Washington, D.C. in particular. And African American women in northern and western cities begin to mobilize to provide support and relief both to Black soldiers and to Black refugees during the Civil War, as they realized that the US Army is unprepared and in some instances unwilling to provide that kind of care and support. So Black women build a network of benevolent organizations during the Civil War, and that network is never extinguished. It is, in fact, we can see, if you will, the echoes of that network even today in the organizing of a state like Georgia, because it is organizing that is happening under the auspices of church communities, for example. And these are the institutions that are the bedrock then of the women who come to found the club movement. So by the 1890s, when the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs is founded, that is an organization that is sort of animating and bringing together under one umbrella an old network of Black women's benevolent organizations that have been at work for a very long time to ensure that Black Americans provide for one another, and in some instances extract from state and local officials the kind of resources that they require in the 19th century. It will go on to blossom so much so that by the eve of the First World War, there'll be 300,000 members of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Though it's important to say, as impressive as that is, that organization is dwarfed by the National Baptist Convention's Women's Convention, which is 3 million women across the United States, 3 million Black women organized in part around women's rights and women's voting rights in the 20th century. So old networks being reanimated and repurposed is part of the story of the club movement.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Sandra, I'll unmute you. Go ahead. No, you have to hit, go ahead and hit it again.
So, no?
There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah. That was just inquiring about young women. Are there lots of, is there the verve and commitment that you find in younger Black women?
You know, many of the women whom I've invoked today might sound as if they were working at the height or the pinnacle or at the maturity of their political careers, but in fact, they're very young women. Many of them have begun as educators, some of them as journalists. These are the kinds of endeavors that almost inevitably bring many of these women into American politics. In Washington, D.C., for example, where Mary Church Terrell is helping to found the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She's an educator. She's a teacher at the fabled M Street High School in that city. And her fellow teachers, young women, and her students are a who's who of African-American women's politics in the 20th century. It's in fact extraordinary. Nannie Helen Burroughs, who will head the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention, lead those 3 million Black women activists across the country, is a student of Mary Church Terrell, the young teacher at the M Street High School. So partly it is a story about young women, but it is partly a story about generations. And that's really critical facet of the story, is that it is not simply one that unfolds over time, but it is one that is very deliberately pulled into the future, pushed out into the future by women who, like Mary Church Terrell or Ida B. Wells or Mary Mcleod Bethune, women who do not live to see the adoption of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, but who understand the essential investment that they make in next generations of women who will see that work through. And that is what I think part of what Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris, is trying to tell us, not simply that she stands figuratively on shoulders, but in fact, it is the work on the ground and the institution building and more that makes her political education and her political career possible.
Thank you. Thank you. Any others? Well, at least I will say, while others may be thinking their questions, that I have fond greetings for you from my son, David Myers, and his wife, Nomi.
Well, I thank you for that. And I can't tell you how honored and charmed I am by the connection, because they are two wonderful friends and colleagues. And so it's a special treat for me to have the chance to collaborate with you. If we have like a few more minutes, there's one more thing that I'll share with the group about this work, which is that Vanguard, the book, from which upon which I've drawn today, 3 weeks ago was in essence banned by a Lafayette, Louisiana public library board.
Okay.
And
Banned by the library.
The Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities had funded a program that would have convene a public conversation about the history of voter suppression and voting rights at the public library there in Lafayette. And Vanguard was was one of 2 books that were to be featured. And the library rejected the grant, saying that it wanted, that the program didn't sufficiently reflect both sides of the issue. And I have to say that I think actually both sides are represented in Vanguard, that you can't understand Black women's struggles for voting rights if you don't understand, for example, the force of the Ku Klux Klan in the life of someone and the work of someone like Mary Mcleod Bethune. But it is true that the Klan is not portrayed in a laudatory light in this story. The Klan is an agent, a despicable agent of voter suppression. But I raise that to say that there was a lot I did anticipate about, and I welcomed in publishing this book. And I think it has done good and important work in our conversations about voting rights and politics more generally. But I never imagined that a book about Black women's voting rights struggles would be, in essence, suppressed by a public library, would be deemed to be so one-sided or incendiary that it couldn't be the anchor for a public conversation. And I'm very grateful to the American Library Association, the National Library Association, who stood up importantly to defend the book, yes, but to defend the librarians who had organized this program. And it will happen under the auspices of the local university. But it's a reminder. I meet a lot of people who ask me, why didn't I know this history? Why didn't I learn this history in school? And there are lots of ways to answer that question, but it turns out in some quarters, there are folks for whom this is history too provocative to place on the public stage. And I still have a lot of reflecting to do about that part of the story.
Are there any other questions or comments?
So I will say that that's rather depressing, and we may try to do something about introducing the book to libraries and university here.
Yeah. I can't say, frankly, and I imagine you all can appreciate why. I can't really say how widespread or how representative the library board in Lafayette is as we think about these questions nationally. But it was a reminder to me as someone who writes and teaches women's history, African American history, a reminder that our subjects are still, for some Americans, out of bounds.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
so thank you
agree.
for that.
Other questions? More do you want? Yeah. Well, we thank you, and I'm looking forward to reading the book, as I'm sure others are. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And thank you.
Be safe, everybody.
We're honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Bravo.
We're gonna
Hey.
reach it, I think.
Ciao. See if I can do this.
Is there someone